Thank you. So we are quorate formally, thanks to Harvey. I'm hoping other members who promised to come in will come in, but we have members online as well. So I think it's important we carry on, not least because there's a very substantial agenda this evening, and I will try and take as many items as possible, but I don't want to compromise some of the very important issues or rush them through. So we may want to delay some of these for the meeting which we'll be having in February. We'll see how we go. The other issue is members have asked for a break, which I think, given the length of this meeting, is entirely appropriate, and I propose to take one at about 7:45, with a possible other one depending on how we're doing. With that, can I launch into the business? First of all, apologies for absence.
Councillor McMahon has given his apologies.
Thank you. No others. Declarations of interest. Any? Yeah, Harvey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's recorded. Then moving on to the minutes of the previous meeting. Any problems with the accuracy, first of all? Not seeing any online. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, Anna, come in.
Oh, hi. I'm usually quite good. I'm sure I gave my apologies for last meeting. It's not been recorded, but that might be. Yeah. This one looked like I was being rude.
I'm sorry, Anna. The sound in this building is so poor.
Can I write it in the box?
Do you understand what she said?
He gave her apologies for the last meeting.
Ah, right. Thanks, Anna. I've now got your message, and we'll certainly incorporate those in. Next, let's just review the action points. Peter did circulate an update on those, so I'm only proposing to take those where there is a promise of a verbal update, and just going through those. The finance update on the Hardship Fund. Ian, are you able to help us on that?
Yes, certainly. I'll cover it in the overall financials.
Yeah, okay, that'll come later in the meeting, it's fine. Just going through those circulated. And I think, yes, the housing revenue account items, I'm looking forward to Steve's later report as part of that, or an Ashman to bring us up to date on the issues of repairs and debt. And there's one item finally with under 8, James Goddard on the confirm this indicator required in refinement. Good. Welcome. Can we sit as close as possible, please? That'd be great. I don't know whether we can, Ashman can help us on that. That's updating on fire sustainability in the borough. And he said this indicator required refinement, and an update was made to the committee. I'm not getting anyone indicating on that. Okay, well, can we come back to that and press James for an update to be circulated to the committee? Yeah, no, I've got it. Right, Gilbert, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and Happy New Year, everyone.
just on page 23 of the minutes, 8.10, just relating to details about how risks were assessed. We've had further kind of communication with the people in the audit team, and they think it's a great idea to have a session covering Hackney's approach to risk management and scoring. And Michael Sheffield has said that we could do something maybe ahead of the April meeting. I don't know, Chair, if you are kind of accepting of that idea, and if the group as a whole is accepting of that idea. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Michael, are you able to respond? Can you just put your mic on?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. We'll be happy to do that. We'll prepare something in advance of the April meeting.
Good. Thanks very much for that. Right. Let's. Do you want to just give the background? I'm finding it extraordinarily difficult to hear with this speaker. It's very distorted. It's in the wrong place. So I'm going to rely on others to help me on this one. But Michael, yeah.
Sure. So there was some questions at the last meeting about Hackney's approach to risk management, and it was suggested it would be particularly helpful if we could work through some live examples of how risks have been scored at the council, and also a little bit of background to the risk management process more generally. So we'll put together a session to cover that ahead of the next meeting.
Great. Right. We're now not only quorum, we've got double the quorum. Quorum for Audit Committee is 2 members. Fortunately, Harvey was on time, so he and I were able to launch this meeting. But you and Margaret coming has given us a very comfortable quorum. Always useful, Ian. Right, let's move on to the first item, which is a report from Ian on the overall financial position, particularly important in light of this being the first opportunity members have to hear about how the implications of the local government settlement just before Christmas work out. So Ian, do you want to take us through that, please?
So great stuff, and good afternoon and good evening and happy New Year, everybody. Hope you're all well. So what we're going to run through this evening is updates on where we are for the current financial year for the general fund and the housing revenue account. I'm going to give you an update on the progress that's been made so far in relation to next year's budget. So in particular, the work that still needs to be done to finalise the budget for 22-23. Okay, right. So if I speak a bit, is that any better? That's cool. Right, no problem. Great stuff. So do let me know if the audio drops, so to speak. So what we're going to run through this evening, as set out on the slides, is a forecast update for 2021-22. We're going to give an update on the budget for 22-23, and then we'll talk about the provisional local government finance settlement before going on to an update on the accounts position for 19-20 and 2021. So quite a few years we're going to run through today. Cool. So the position that we're reporting to Cabinet at the last meeting, so December, was a continuing improvement in the position in terms of the general fund forecast. You'll recall that when we brought a paper to this meeting back in October, we were forecasting an overspend of around just over £7 million. We also in that report set out a range of measures that we were going to bring into play to bring the overspend down, and it's pleasing to see that those have worked. I'll talk about some of those in a moment. But obviously, since then, we've had the continuing challenges of Omicron and the ongoing issues in relation to the pandemic. So it's something we need to make sure we maintain focus on and really keep an eye on, because any overspend that we accumulate in the current year obviously can have, if not dealt with for future years, have an ongoing impact, and we want to minimise any of that completely. It's pretty fair to say that the causes of those overspends predominantly aren't any great surprise. Real challenges coming through the system in terms of COVID from, for example, pressures in the areas you'd expect, so children placements, staffing in children's services costs because we had to bring extra resources to deal with a high number of cases, as well as challenges in adult services as we're seeing more people being discharged from hospital quicker. And it's a picture that's very consistent with what we're seeing across London. Neighbourhoods and housing colleagues are also forecasting an overspend on a range of areas. Predominantly, it's in relation to losses of income. So it will be things like where the commercial waste service hasn't had the business that it would have expected, and there'll be other income generation activities that obviously are suffering because of the consequence of the pandemic. Turning to the housing revenue account, we're forecasting the position here similar to what we've been reporting previously. I'm mindful we've got a substantive item on this later, so if it's okay, Chair, I'll skirt over this part of the presentation, so I know we'll cover it in more detail when Steve and Ajman give us an update later, but there's nothing in the update I'm going to give here that's a surprise that you haven't heard before. It's ongoing pressure on income, challenges in repairs to the DLO, and some losses on our commercial income due to obviously challenges with businesses in the pandemic. So budget update for 22-23. Since the last audit committee, we held that joint audit committee scrutiny sessions in October and November, and budget proposals, savings proposals, were agreed by Cabinet at its meeting on the 13th of December. And the full details of those were all published in the papers. I'm sure members have had a chance to look at those. Following Cabinet, we finally received the Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement on the 16th of December, and that was very much in line with our expectations, what we've been forecasting in our plans on the back of what we saw in the spending review. So we're very close now to finalising the position for 22-23 and setting out a balanced budget for that period. And of course, we'll be bringing further reports back to through the usual process, through scrutiny, through Cabinet and through full council later in the forthcoming months. I would just remind members that the full council meeting is actually on the 2nd of March, not the week before, so just to make sure people have amended their diaries accordingly, because I wouldn't want you to miss it. Turning to the housing revenue account budget proposals, again, as we've set out previously, great work by Ajman, Steve, finance teams to get this position together in what are challenging circumstances with the pandemic, the pressures that's brought to bear on income collection, and the fact that there's been no additional government support for the housing revenue account to the same extent that it was for the general fund. So it's really pleasing that we're in a position to bring forward a balanced budget position for 22-23, and I know that Steve and Ajman will talk about that in a bit more detail later, so I won't steal any of their thunder. But I do think that table that's set out at the bottom of the slide is an important one to remind people that still, average rents in the borough, notwithstanding the real cost pressures our residents are experiencing, are still relatively low at £103, and actually not that much higher than they were back in 2015-16, following the 4 years of the 1% rent decrease. So I just think it's important to sort of have that in our minds in terms of a slide of reference. Turning then to the Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement, I suppose that the headlines that I would draw people's attention to from this, I'm not sure who that was, would be that the actual settlement was only a 1-year settlement. Whilst there was a spending review that covered 3 years, the specific details for individual local authorities were only announced for the forthcoming financial year. And so I think it's important that we bear in mind the fact that there's still now ever more greater uncertainty beyond 22-23. Whilst councils will have access to what's called a one-off services grant, The simple reality with that is that the majority of that money, if not all of it, in essence, is needed to cover off our increase in national insurance costs. So members of the committee will recall that when the changes to adult social care through the national insurance contribution changes was identified, there are obviously costs that the local authority will incur, that our suppliers, our providers will also incur, and that's a significant sum of money. And from the analysis the team have been doing for me over the last couple of weeks, that will largely consume all of this extra money. And a big concern that certainly Jackie, myself and the team have is that, and obviously Councillor Chapman, is that this grant has only been confirmed for 1 year. And obviously we know that national insurance cost pressures are actually ongoing beyond the next financial year. So it's something which we'll be feeding back in our response to the local government consultation, which closed on the 13th of January very robustly. Please see that all other expectations of funding were broadly in line with what we've been expecting. So no surprises, which is always good. But beyond 22-23, we're still in that what feels like holding pattern of added uncertainty. What the government has said is it intends to consult with local authorities and the wider public sector on funding distribution methodologies beyond 22-23, and as soon as those are released, obviously we'll be working through them in detail and working closely with Councillor Chapman, the Mayor and other colleagues. We'll obviously hold the necessary briefing sessions, because I'm sure members will be interested in the detail of what's contained in those, and we'll want to ask questions in appropriate forums. In terms of then education funding, an area which I know this committee has extensive interest in, whilst it looks like the council is going to receive some extra support for SEND high needs block of the order of £4.8 million, it's worth remembering that the current in-year pressure on SEND alone is around £7 million. So again, through the consultation and working with other London boroughs and actually boroughs outside London, we'll be feeding back again the consistent messages now that the funding for SEND is not sufficient and needs to be further looked at, and we'll be lobbying hard on that point as well. Shall I pause for there, Chair, and take some questions if people have got them, or are you happy for me to move on? Yeah. So the simple reality of that is the continuation in essence of the story which we've had now for a number of years, which the actual cost pressures we're experiencing in adult social care are not being met by the additional grants that are announced. And what we're having to look to do is top that up from our own resources through by making extra savings in other areas where possible. But as I'm sure I know see Councillor Kennedy on the call will confirm really that what we are seeing, particularly after the pandemic impacts work themselves through the system, the cost pressures continue to rise. And I think I know from talking to some of the boroughs in outer London that have a different demographic to ours, they're experiencing some absolutely frightening figures in terms of the adult social care costs they're getting, particularly some of the outer northeast boroughs. But again, happy to provide more detail on that if you have further questions.
Right, so did they not hear my question? Right, okay. I was just going to say, yes, if we could have further, any further questions, it's just a great matter of concern, I know, to many councillors, as you're well aware. And if there's any chance of bringing pressure to bear on the government in some way, I think we're happy to do that in a political way, because they should be providing some form of help. It's no good providing jam in the future when we want jam today. That's ridiculous.
Certainly in the draft that we've prepared for our response to the provisional local government finance settlement, we've made sure that point is made very loud and clear, and I'm sure once that's signed off, it will be circulated to members in the usual way. Thank you.
Two other people wanting to make contribution. Gilbert, first of all.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously it's welcome that we're getting 4.8 million from the government for SEND, but that does leave us with a projected shortfall of 2 million. I just wanted to ask Ian, how he thinks that shortfall will affect the service and what we can do to potentially mitigate against any of those negativities. Thank you.
For me to respond, yeah. So thanks for that question, Councillor Smythe. I mean, in simple terms, what we've looked to do is where there has been a shortfall and where we can, we've looked to make good any deficit. But again, as some members of this committee will know, there has been a provision in place for the last couple of financial years and for the next financial year for authorities to effectively carry forward a deficit on their SCND high needs block. Now, it's not something that I'm particularly comfortable in us doing. I think it's something which, particularly given the time limited nature of the way that it has been allowed to happen, and some boroughs I know have run up high needs deficits of the orders of 20-30 million pounds. That's something we'd certainly never do. But we would obviously look to mitigate any increase in a deficit arising, because actually the spend in the SCND area is something that is statutory. So actually it's very hard to simply not do it, and that's not something obviously we would do. So what we look to do is identify as much resource as we can to supplement what we get from the government where that's possible.
Thank you. And Councillor Chapman, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to add in response to Councillor Rathbone's point that obviously we'll be responding to the settlement, and there'll be the technical response, but I will, with the Mayor, will be writing with the political response as well.
Thanks, sir.
So very quickly then, turning to an accounts update. I know we've got quite a few items from the auditors on the agenda. So where are we with the 1920 accounts? Just by way of reminder, the accounts were signed off by external auditors Mazars on the 21st of October 2021. Work is now complete by the Mazars team in relation to the cyber attack, and that report is finalised, and they're now in the position to issue a positive value for money conclusion in terms of what's been reached in relation to that. Turning to the draft 2020-21 accounts, they've been published online, and the external audit is underway, and the teams are engaging very well and working hard to get those accounts audited as quickly as is possible, given all the other competing pressures that are on the various teams, be it the council teams or the external audit team as well. Obviously, the audit regime, as you know, continues to be challenging in terms of the requirements imposed on the firms when they audit local authorities, because of the regime being so aligned to what the private sector has. But our aim is to get all the work completed by Audit Committee in April. So I'm sure we can maybe take more detailed questions when Suresh and the team present their items if people don't have them now.
Thanks very much. Okay, for no other questions on Ian's report, I propose we move on.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I have a question. Sorry.
There is. Michelle?
Yes, I think Ian was going to update us on the Hardship Fund when he did his report. Still,
Gregory, I can certainly give a quick update on that. I've pulled together a short note for colleagues on this, and what I can confirm is that in financial year 2021, the council spent just under £104,000. Current financial year, so only 9 months into the financial year, we've spent near over £123,000. So certainly we're seeing expenditure increase, and my expectation is that figure will continue to rise as the year progresses. What I can also say is that I've been working closely with colleagues in the chamber with me this evening, and colleagues on the call, including Councillor Chapman, but also Councillor Ette, and we're looking to see and bring forward further measures to how we can further accelerate or maximise our expenditure in relation to not just this scheme, but also other schemes the council has, and where that is not as it's not practicable, seeing whether it's possible to repurpose things into other hardship type work, but obviously making sure we maintain our approach to value for money. But that's something we will be able to update on in the coming weeks. So thank you.
Thank you. What was the total budget? And I also just want to follow that up. Sorry to take up time, but there was an announcement by the council that the government has given local authorities more money for hardship, for money for people, which we were asked to kind of promote to residents. So yes, how much hardship money did we have that we set aside? How much has been, what percentage of it has been spent? And are we going to be able to give out this other hardship money when we seem to be struggling to give out our own budget? Thanks.
So I think it's very important to distinguish the differences between the schemes. So the scheme that's been announced nationally has a particular agreed framework building upon the schemes that we've put in place now for the last 18 months. And there's been a working group across the council to make sure that money can be dispensed. Colleagues jointly in finance and policy, working with Councillor Chapman, Councillor Kennedy, have been working hard to make sure that those monies can be spent. So they've covered things like food vouchers for youngsters in school holidays, as an example, but there've been a catalogue of other things that they've covered. And I can certainly get a note on that in more detail, Councillor Gregory, about what we've spent so far and how we plan to make sure we spend all the monies that we've got. And I'm very confident, as we've managed to spend all the grants in relation to that so far, we will be able to do that. Turning to our own resource, we're on target to spend, I would say, between 30 to 40% of it, but it's important to remember it's a very particular scheme. And what we're looking to see is whether we can flex the design of that scheme more, or say repurpose some of the monies to more targeted support. But again, it is always important to make sure that we get maximum outcome for the resources that we've got.
Okay, thank you. It was something we
Thank
did
you.
ask
Thank
about
you.
last
Can
year.
we move on?
Sorry, Ian. Sorry, Nick. It's just that every year we're underspending on this, and last year we asked that it could be repurposed. And we've got people building up debt, and we're not spending our own hardship fund. That's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that point will be taken on board. Hey, can we now move on to the performance report? Go ahead, Harvey.
The last one.
Sorry. Following on from what Councillor Gregory just was talking about, Prime Minister today referred to, I believe it was, he referred to two different figures from what I heard, an additional 500 million, an additional 600 million to councils for hardship. Roughly how much of that is likely to come Hackney's way, and what use will we put it to?
I'd need to see the specifics of what monies the Prime Minister is referring to. So if it's okay, Councillor Odds, I'll come back to you separately offline, just making sure I'm clear on what exactly the funds he's referring to are, because I recognise those numbers also as the increases that are in the control totals for the financial years beyond 22-23. So I just want to make sure that we're not going to end up conflating or mixing up any of the numbers that are there, but I will come back to you separately if that's okay, and obviously circulate the notes to the rest of the committee members as well.
Very good, thank you. Yeah.
Just a very quick question. I noticed that you're saying that Mazar's report on the cyber attack is complete. Are we seeing that at all? Is it on the agenda? Okay.
Last item on the agenda.
And it's not there. Right. Okay.
Okay, can we move on then to item 5, performance report? And I propose to look particularly at the performance indicators and the capital programme update on this. The element of strategic risk appears on the agenda under a corporate risk register. So, Bruce, do you want to just highlight any issues on this report on the performance indicators?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's on the whole, it's predominantly sort of more of the same from previous quarters. There's not a tremendous amount that is different, but obviously just to sort of really highlight the main areas, which are the sort of continuing level of high staff sickness. But I know you've received some additional information on that from HR in the last sort of couple of weeks. We've got sort of continuing rent arrears, but I know that Steve and Ashman will pick that up later in the agenda on their item. There's been some improvement on voids, though the levels of numbers of days still remain high. We've got a drop in the numbers of people in temporary accommodation for the first time in a couple of years, which is obviously some good news, but only a slight drop. And there's also some good news there in terms of increased levels of recycling as well. But obviously, happy to answer questions if I can. But obviously, others are on the call who may be better placed to answer those than myself.
Thanks for that summary. We've got some questions. I think the issues to me particularly revolve around some of the housing and debt issues, and I know we're coming back to that later in the agenda from the later item. The sickness issue is obviously very concerning, and particularly in light of the Omicron, the impact of Omicron on the council services. So I know we're looking at a backward indicator here, but I think it would be helpful just to note that issue as a particular concern. Right, I have questions from Harvey, first of all, then Anna, and then Gilbert.
Thank you. I'm always rather loath to load extra work onto officers. I was wondering whether it would be at the moment possible or politic to, on the sickness 12-month rolling average, to separate out the things that are directly due to COVID from other sickness and have two separate indicators there, or an overall and two separate ones. And also, if there are any indicators there where we can directly separate out things that are due to the cyber attack, whether we could have those as separate amounts, since they are hopefully short term and might lessen some of the downward arrows.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, Ian, you want
So
to
if
try
I
and
take the
respond to that?
sickness question, certainly Councillor Odson, just for members of the committee who haven't seen the figures, what we did prepare outside of the meeting and circulated in advance was the changes in the 12-month rolling average. So we took it as at the end of November, which would be the last sort of full month when we sent out the paperwork. So at the end of November 2019, the rolling average was 9.51 days. At the end of November 2021, the average was 10.92 days, so an increase of 1.41 days if my maths is working. I think it is. So obviously not an insignificant increase, and it is one which certainly myself and Stuart have been reporting now consistently to the management team, and it is something that the Hackney management team is looking to take action to address. Obviously it's challenging because within those figures not insignificant elements relate to COVID, so it will be possible to draw out for you some analysis to sort of distinguish as much as we can how much of that number relates to COVID, and I will just make sure also that we can see whether there's other categories we can include in that as well, because I know from some of my own service areas that some of the drivers of the numbers in the departmental figures actually can be a handful of very sadly quite long-term cases. You know, I know particularly within some of the core finance divisions at the moment, we've got a number of cases where people have got, you know, long-term, quite terminal illnesses, and obviously those have a disproportionate impact on the statistics as well. So I will also see whether we can draw out long-term as well, because I know we can do it on a sort of team by team basis. So if you can bear with me on that, I'll certainly provide an update again, probably to the next committee, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Councillor Lynch.
Thank you. I think Councillor Harvey's actually just asked my question. But when I got the figures, I was like, for me, it was just numbers. You need to see some sort of like trajectory or have some sort of, for me, what is an acceptable percentage for you as a council to have as a sickness. So, for example, within the NHS, we tend to run on a if anything gets, in particular areas, you would break it down to, you would allow for sickness within your establishment of your staff as well, so that it isn't, even though people are off sick, it's not going to impact on the service. But the point I wanted to make, which is sort of potentially, it's not at the moment, but personal to me at the moment, but it's just something to be aware of, is within the NHS, they have made temporary amendments to some of their sort of sickness, sort of national policies, and also sort of at local levels, that if people are off sick due to COVID related sickness, then they are then automatically not part of what would potentially happen in terms of managing someone's long-term sickness as well. And I think it would be really useful, and I'm more than happy to share this in terms of the data, that in how you can present it so that it does do those categories of long, short term, but also does feature in, you could also, without wanting to break confidentiality, you can break it down into particular reasons as well. So an example would be that, and it may be something that might be prevalent within adult social care, that sometimes the biggest reason is because of people have musculoskeletal injuries and things like that, due to, and probably with any of the roles that we have for our staff that do quite physical roles. So again, it's something that you could focus on. I'm not going to keep banging on about this, but we still haven't got a workforce strategy, which we brought up as a request back in August. But this is part of that overarching need to sort of look at your workforce and look at where your weaknesses are. And if there is something around, you've got a high.
Anna, what's the question?
Well, the question is the council still performance managing people with COVID-related illnesses in terms of their sickness management? Or are they being treated as a different group of staff who, to put it bluntly, may have caught COVID during the course of their duties?
Okay, I think we got the question. Yeah, Ian.
Thank you for that, Councillor Lynch. And just to confirm, and I will include it in the note where I provide the details of the more detailed analysis on the sickness stats, but that's very similar to the approach the council's adopting. Obviously, we have to make sure that it's recognising the distinctions between where it was COVID previously and where it now is other things, also being mindful of track record and history even before the pandemic. But it is pretty fair to say that the council, consistently with other London boroughs, did bring in a number of flexibilities and changes to its approach to absence management, to things like dependency leave, a whole range of those sort of factors at the outset of the pandemic, alongside obviously the working from home flexibilities. But what I'll do is in the note on the data and the stats, I'll just do a summary of some of the things that we've brought in and how we've looked to record separately the COVID impact, and obviously treat that differently to how we would have treated sickness previously.
Councillor Smythe, do you want to come in?
Thank you. Just a very quick point, Chair. And I might not have seen this come through, but just on 5.8, back to the minutes, in terms of recycling, it was agreed that the information would be circulated about that last time by Bruce. So recycling rates, 5.8. I don't know if that has or not.
As far as I'm aware, Councillor, it was by that team, but I will double check back, and if it hasn't got to you, we'll get it to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Bruce. Let's move on then to the capital programme. And I think, Jackie Moylan, are you poised to just introduce this report?
Yes, yeah, hopefully you can hear me. So what I've done here this time, I've slightly changed the format of this and to try and make it more user-friendly and to give you a better idea in terms of the breakdown of the capital programme across the council and where there's been slippage and the main reasons for that slippage. So on the first page, you've got a table which summarises the overall capital programme, and you will see there that we are forecasting 170 million spend against the original estimate back in February 2021 of 236 million. And the main drivers for that are around where the big schemes are. So, for example, in housing, AMP programme, housing regeneration and supplies, and also in the mixed use scheme. I mean, there are some COVID impacts here, I would say, because when we were setting the budget for 2021-22, we wasn't forecasting further lockdown, etc., and that's had a big impact, particularly on the AMP programme. Also, it's worth noting that in some areas, particularly around estate regen and housing supply, we've got issues where the tender prices are coming back above what the cost estimates were. So further work needs to be done to ensure those schemes are viable and affordable to take forward. And that's really one of the main drivers of the change in the profiling of the capital spend. I'm happy to take questions. I've tried to put in as much detail as possible without overloading it. So if there's any questions, I'll either try to answer them, or I can take them away to my colleagues.
Councillor Sharman, you're on mute.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely right. The variance is around the 25%. Some of it, that's going to be take us back to the levels, if we go on at that, which is going to get us back to where we were before we looked at this issue. So I'm hoping that the last 2 quarters, i.e. up to December and then up to March, are not going to see any significant slippage. But I take the point that the COVID does have an impact and cyber has an impact, so I understand that. I'm looking to be reassured that the additional controls we've got on capital estimations are beginning to have an effect. Are you able to say anything about that?
I think it'd be fair to say if you look at line by line basis, in some areas there are, but in some of the more tricky areas less so. But there has been a big impact of COVID, and one of the things that we're doing in terms of particularly for the housing AMP programme for next year is very much looking at the realism of what actually can be delivered in year. So we would expect that the capital programme of 22-23 will be set at a more realistic level, taking into account slippage, but also taking into account what physically can be delivered in that year as well.
Great, thanks very much. If there are no other questions on capital spending, I do emphasise to members that this is an absolutely key part of our performance drivers and budget drivers. It delivers to residents in all sorts of ways, and we'll hear about the housing critical issue of housing investment in terms of repairs later on. But more broadly, how we spend our capital is a key variable and a key risk area for us in terms of both the services and the financial position of the council. So I do think keeping this as a high profile presentation is very important to us. Councillor Smythe, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. You're dead right. This is a really important, critical component of what we're thinking about here. Yeah, 4.7.2 in the agenda speaks of the fact that we're going from a debt-free position to an external borrowing position. We have been going to that position over the last few years, and it's saying essentially that that the borrowing is forecast to increase further over the next few years, as plans include bringing forward the next phases of both the Britannia scheme and our regeneration programme. I mean, could the Finance Director just speak about that borrowing forecast just a little bit, just to get a handle on how much we're talking about there? Thank you.
Sorry, we're just trying to find the part in the agenda. Yeah, so in essence, we've got quite a lot, as you know, we've got a large capital programme, and that includes an element of forward funding of some of the social housing, and also the Britannia Leisure Centre, etc., and the school. And there'll be an element of borrowing that will need to be undertaken in order to forward fund that, because ultimately they'll be funded primarily by the sale of private units, and we need to be borrowing ahead of time, basically, to forward fund the delivery of those social elements of the schemes. And similarly on the housing regen programme, where we'll be delivering potentially affordable housing in advance of the sale of private units. In terms of the scale of that borrowing, we're undertaking that work at the moment, actually, for the 22-23 budget report, and should be a better sort of idea of where that might sit in that report. We don't anticipate there'll be significantly increased borrowing in the next financial year, but potentially beyond that. Don't know if you want to add anything into that.
I think it's also fair to say it also depends upon the mixture of the council's future capital programme ambitions as well. So obviously, as Jack has outlined, some of the schemes are ultimately funded by sales and receipts, but if there aren't schemes coming forwards that contain properties for sale, for example, they will obviously just need to be financed through rent income. But as we know, that goes nowhere near the costs of actually financing the cost of building properties, which currently the average cost of a new build, particularly given with contract price inflation of late, is somewhere of the order of £450,000 for a unit on an average basis, which is quite staggering, but just reflects the challenges that are out there in the construction market that I'm sure we all see as well, where we have to try and get work done in our homes at the moment. But certainly happy to do more updates on that with the relevant teams, so that people are aware of the challenges that are faced. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, let's move on then. And pleased to say the next two items on Treasury Management is a compensation for these reports always being shoved right to the end of the audit, and those reporting on them have had to wait for a considerable time. We've brought them forward, I think, not only because of that, but because actually they're particularly relevant in a time of financial turbulence. And the point that we just made about the importance of capital spending, because both on our borrowing and our holding of reserves are much more sensitive. So I'm ask officers to highlight key points in this report, please.
We've got Pradeep's on the call, so he's going to take us through these two reports. If it's okay, Chair, I suggest we take both reports together.
Pradeep, you're with us. Do go ahead. Remember, this is for you.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Chair. Good evening and Happy New Year to everyone. So for this audit committee, we have two treasury reports, like Ian mentioned. The first report is basically just mentioned the first half for this current financial year, which is Appendix 1. And the second part of that, the same report, is basically update on the Q3, which is Appendix 2 for the current financial year. Both the first half, the Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, compare the investment balances and the borrowing positions at the beginning of the period and at the end of the period. Looking at the report, the first half has already been, the audit committee was updated with all the numbers in the previous audit committee meetings. In the Q3, there are no major recommendations or any issues arising. So that's the first report, just to update, on the activities of the audit committee. Second report is on the treasury management strategy for the next year. What we have is a draft report. if you look at the report, we haven't done any major changes to our strategy, purely because of the reason that our position, the investment levels, or our portfolio, the nature of our investment, we haven't changed much from last year. We had numerous meetings with our treasury advisors, and we didn't see a point changing our investment strategies, considering how the market is with the Omicron and different mutations, the inflation, the interest rate. So we have kept our strategy more or less in line with the current year strategy, which is 21-22. So these are two updates for Audit Committee for this time. I'm happy to take any questions if I can ask them now, or I'll just take them and then come back to you on those.
Very helpful. Thanks, Pradeep. I must say that just to emphasise point, I mean, that we've been making. I'm just looking at those. The gross capital financing requirement goes up from 450 million to 740 million over the next 2 or 3 years. So the issue of how we finance that is absolutely crucial in very uncertain markets. And I think it's worth just underlining that many of the councils that are now running into significant problems, financial problems, the origin has often been in their capital spending and overexposure to some of those investments. So this is, just to emphasize a point, a critical area for us. I guess one of the interesting issues you raised in this report is around the borrowing strategy, and whether, particularly as Public Works Loan Board money gets more expensive, whether we move into more diverse sources, particularly the issuing of bonds, which moves us into in a substantial way. If we move there, then we're moving into a different era. And I know many local authorities are going down that path. So I guess it's just, as I say, to underline the importance of this issue, to record, I think we'd all agree, the current prudent approach to this is the right one, but we are going to be exposed to more risk in this area over the next few years. Councillor Smythe.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, Treasury Management is a kind of specialist area, and I personally feel that I would really benefit from some training and guidance and maybe a bit of support in regards to undertaking scrutiny of the Treasury function. I'm just wondering if that might be possible sometime in the future. Thank you.
Yep, Ian.
Thank you for that question, Councillor Smythe, and absolutely, I think some long-standing members of this committee will recall that we have actually held training sessions for members of the Audit Committee in previous sessions, so more than happy to arrange that in the new administration. I think we've even had the opportunity for members, if they wished so much, to actually join Pradeep and the team on the cash desk to see how it operates on a day-to-day basis. So that offer, I'm sure, is available, maybe more virtual than it used to be, but that will also be there. But we'll take away and get a training session in line for the new administration, new municipal year. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I endorse that. I think it's a key area that's been knocked aside a bit by the whole COVID experience over the last 18 months plus. So I think trying to get that back online is crucial. Yes, Councillor Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. I'd be really grateful if you could maybe talk us through the issues around the investment strategy, because the investment balance has obviously been reduced since last year. But I mean, if you could particularly talk us through how the decisions are made in relation to the investment portfolio, and how the particular investments are chosen, and how that's consistent with the council's broader strategies, obviously in relation to divesting from net zero and fossil fuels, and our other strategies in relation to ethical investments. Thank you.
So I think, just to be clear, Councillor Gordon, if that's okay, the term investments in the Treasury Management world is nothing to do with investments in relation to the pension fund. So they're completely separate. So when we talk about investments here, it's in line with our Treasury Management strategy, where we place our cash, for want of a better word, on a day-to-day basis. So what we agree each year as part of the budget setting report is effectively a list of approved establishments, so principally banks, where we can place money. And what we do is we place limits on those monies so that we're not overexposed to one institution or another in terms of its financial sustainability. Some members of the committee might recall that some councils over a decade ago now got caught out when the Icelandic banks issue happened, and the actual system and governance arrangements in which local authorities are able to and do invest their cash balances, of which in the last 18 months ours have fluctuated significantly as we've had significant sums of money come to us to then spend in terms of business rate grants, for example. You'll recall that, you know, at the very outset of the pandemic, we had to move quickly to dispense over £60 million of business grants, but actually that was cash that sat on our balance sheet, and we had to find places to place that on a day-to-day basis whilst the teams worked through the payment out of that money. But as I say, it's in the Treasury Management strategy report, it sets out very clearly the institutions that we invest with, and they aren't in the same way or ilk the types of investments we make as part of the pension fund.
Thanks very much. I obviously appreciate it's separate from the pension fund, but I mean, obviously the net zero strategy is something that goes across all the activities of the council. So I don't know whether there's a, sorry, you can't, yeah. I mean, obviously the net zero strategy does go across all the activities of the council. So I just wondered what sort of intersection is with in relation to investment strategy, whether that's something that maybe is under development or.
I mean, it's, if I take as an example the types of institutions we place money with, it would be traditional banks. It would be places like Santander in terms of they would hold cash for us. So it is different from buying an asset class in the pension fund. It just isn't the same. It's just different structure to that. But happy to do a more detailed session with people to go through that in more detail if there's an interest in it.
And just to add on what Ian said, we can pick this up in the training sessions. But just to add on to add what Ian was saying, the way we pick investment counterparties, establishments, is we work closely with our advisors, and they put a lot of effort in the coming back on what counterparties are safe, the limits we need to place, their ratings. They work with Moody's, Fitch, and other rating agencies. So they do a lot of work for us, and then based on those analysis, we look at where we should invest, and then we decide what's good for the council, and that's how we invest our money.
And very much at its outset is the principle of
one
security.
more on Michelle.
Yes, hi, thank you. Yes, I went to the Treasury Management training. It was very interesting and very useful, but I sit on a trust and we have investments. One of the things that the agency does who invests our money is challenge the politics of the organisations that receive our funding. So I suppose, and I also know that ethical funds are performing very well at the moment compared to mainstream funding streams. I wondered if we'd considered that within our investments, or something to think about for the future anyway. Thank you.
I think it's important, and I'm not aware of the organisation that you're on the board of, Councillor Gregory, but I think it's important not to conflate day-to-day management of cash balances with longer-term investments. A lot of the what term investment here does is for relatively short-term investments, of which liquidity and security is the principal purpose. And I think we're in danger of conflating cash flow management with longer-term investments. But again, we'll happily cover that in the training session.
Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. Can we then move on? Thanks very much, Brady. You can go now.
Thank you.
Right, we move on then to two items relating to housing. Item 8, the update on the housing revenue account, which is a report we asked for, and I'm not sure. And then we want to go on to neighbourhood and housing risk register, and obviously there's quite a lot of overlap between those, and I'm not sure how Osman and Steve, you want to take this, but both items, I'm happy to take them in any way that makes logical sense. We can take them to bring out the key issues here.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Happy New Year to you. I think we'll take them separately. So Steve will cover the HRA, and he'll talk more about the repairs and the voids and the rental element of it. And then I'll pick up on the risk register, if that's okay, Councillor Sharman.
Okay, fine. And Steve, if you want to.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can...
Sorry, can you just hang on though? We've got a question here.
Where are we on the agenda?
We're on item 8, update on the
What
housing
page?
revenue account. Item 9 is the...
What page?
It's a presentation, Chair.
It's not in the agenda.
It's a presentation responding to the questions we raised last time, as I understand it.
Right, okay.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I hope everybody can see the presentation. I've followed the format similar to last time, but just focus more on repairs, voids, rent arrears, and the impact that has it from a budget perspective. So I think looking at repairs first, I mean, obviously I set out last time the impact of COVID and the cyber attack. And doing more analysis of that, we've identified or it's, you know, that we've got a backlog of reactive repairs in the region of around 7,000 jobs. Now, there's a number of potential duplications within that, and we're working through that. But as members will have probably seen, just before Christmas, the Mayor and Councillor Mackenzie set out that we'd now put implemented an action plan around that, focused around service delivery and the tenants' experience, and that we committed an additional £1 million of funding to support that work. That £1 million worth of funding is not necessarily always an ongoing bit, because some of it relates to bringing additional staff in, and once we've worked through that backlog, then what that means is by default we will be growing our own, and means we'll have more staff to do the work ourselves rather than give it to external contractors. So we're in the process of appointing just over 30 staff across different roles to cover that work. We have advertised for 14 trade operatives before Christmas, and we had over 80 applicants for that, and we've got some really good candidates that we're going to be interviewing next week and the week after. We're working around how we're building surveying capacity, because we recognise that the length of time to get an appointment for a surveyor is impacting on the quality of what we're delivering. So we've extended that into appointments over the weekend, and we've got staff that are working over, and we're looking at additional capacity to support that in the short term. The mobile working is a real the loss of that has had a real impact on the delivery of the service, and we've now got that back up and working in a basic format, and that's been rolled out to plumbers at the beginning of November. So we've had a couple of months of that, and we're extending that into other teams and from later this month. And what that will do is extend the functionality to allow us to deal with and order follow-on jobs at the point in time, and that's one of the real challenges we've had in getting through follow-on jobs when an operative's not being able to complete the job. It has been a real challenge for us. One of the things that we've highlighted when we've looked at some of the work that's and things that have impacted on some of the customer dissatisfaction is the length of time it gets us to deal with leaks. So we have quite a complex approach at the moment when somebody reports a leak as to whether it's controllable, semi-controllable, or not controllable. And once we've got capacity in place, we will be changing our approach to every report of a leak is a high priority that will result in a 24-hour response, an emergency response from a plumber. And we're also looking at reviewing properties that disproportionately impact on the number of repairs that we get. So looking at some of the performance information that we've got, and unfortunately the lack of the mobile IT system really impacts is on this. So the first indicator that you see at the top of the page is percentage of repairs completed first visit based on tenant satisfaction. At the bottom of the page, we've got the same percentage of repairs completed first visit based on our system generated information. So you'll see historically there's always a lower percentage where tenants feel that we've completed the repair compared to what our system is telling us. And that's a real issue for me, because at the end of the day, you know, if our tenants, our residents are feeling that we've not completed the repair and we're feeling that we have completed the repair, then that's a real mismatch. Performance at Q2, and we're only able to get the tenant satisfaction data at the moment. We were able to start that again from July, was 55.9%. I can say that that has gone up at the end of November to 57.3%. So it is starting to go in the right direction. We won't have the system generated data until we've got mobile working rolled out to all operatives, which will happen later this month and moving into February. Looking at voids, and one of the questions that came up at committee last time was the length of time it's taking to repair void properties, get them relet, and the impact that that has on rental income. It's a real priority for myself. When I came and started here in August, I think the turnaround time was 113 days. That's dropped now at the end of Q2, which I'll show on the next slide, to 97 days. But at the end of November, again, we've reduced that further to 93 days. So it's not where we want it to be. We want to be, you know, around the 40-day mark when looking at major and minor repairs, but we are going in the right direction. And at 93 days, whilst that's still high, actually move a reduction from 103 days, 13 days. So that's almost a 3-week improvement in turnaround time in the last couple of months. So again, that's moving forward. And for those of you that attended the budget drop-in sessions that Councillor Mackenzie hosted around the savings, will have seen that we have actually put a savings target associated with this as well, in the recognition of the improvements that have been made, but also the improvements that we will still make in excess of where we are now. So this is just the performance data that shows where we were at Q1 113.97. Obviously 1920, the average was 55 days. We want to get back to that and below that, and I'm confident with the actions that we've got in place, we will get to achieve that. Rent arrears, which is probably having the biggest challenge and the biggest impact on our budget, is rent arrears at the end of November stood at 14.8 million. And that's an increase of 320,000 from the end of October. Now we are taking small elements of things, and that is the lowest increase, month-on-month increase since June. There are a number of things that sit under this, and we have colleagues in the income team and in IT that are really working towards getting the IT systems back up and running, the managed arrears. I cannot underestimate the impact of not having that arrears system in place, because we're not able to accurately determine when we want to take enforcement action and progress to court without that system in place. The staff are doing a great amount of work to limit and impact the impact of arrears, and we've had significantly more residents move on to universal credit and move away from housing benefit, and that has had some of the challenges as well. And obviously, as a result of the cyber attack, as we all know, the housing benefit system was lost as well. We've been working with our colleagues in benefits and housing needs, and recognising the priorities that have been put in place around how they're working, dealing with properties that are in temporary accommodation and homelessness, and getting those through the system first, which I think is the right thing to do. but we are then tracking the impact of that and working with our colleagues in benefits to actually make sure that we then get and move on to the council tenancies. So no new tenants since August 2021 have had any benefits assessed. So what we've actually looked at is trying to track and manage and understand what the impact of that is. And there's also a high number of cases where benefits were processed between July 20 and October 20, just before the cyber attack, when that data was lost, and that has not yet been resolved. And we anticipate the impact of the housing benefit and universal credit owed to the housing revenue account. Apologies, there's a spelling mistake in there. Is around £2 to £2.5 million that will ultimately be credited to individual accounts. In addition to that, it's not on the slide, but there is also about 600,000 that's allocated in suspense accounts that needs to be moved across to specific tenancy accounts once the data has been re-established. So again, we're looking at significant amounts of money there. It is an increasing picture. Like we said, we are up at 14.8 million. When at the end of the financial year, we were at 11.5 million, just under. There's a lot of work that the teams are doing to try and resolve some of that. We're also looking, I missed a slide earlier. We're also looking at where the arrears are and what proportion of tenants are in arrears. So as you'll see from this slide, by far the biggest proportion of tenants, just over 8,200 of the 12,000 tenants that are in arrears, are in the arrears category of under £1,000. Now that is the easiest category to collect, because it's very early on within the debt profile. Once you start getting into higher amounts, it becomes really difficult to correct. So staff are looking at this, focusing, and we're focusing our resources to enable us to get into to those tenants and deal with them at an early stage. The impact of that on the budget overall, and Ian reflected on some of this and some of the information within his presentation as well. We've got, to summarise, current rent arrears of 14.8 million, approximately 2.5 million with the suspense accounts, possibly up to £3 million of outstanding benefit or money that needs to be allocated to tenancies. Having said that, we are in a position where the HRA is projecting a balanced budget for this year. Savings of £2 million have been identified for next year, which will be presented to Cabinet later this month. And the housing revenue account reserves, and it was a question that was asked at last Audit Committee meeting. At the end of last financial year, the beginning of this financial year, were £11.4 million. Now, you wouldn't offset those current rent arrears against your reserves because we would collect those current rent arrears or work with those residents. We also have bad debt provisions that are built into the budget profile, and we're adding approximately £2.5 million bad debt provision into the budgets on an annual basis, so that we have got sufficient capacity within that bad debt provision to address the potential level of arrears that might ultimately progress to bad debts. I could do and talk a lot more, Chair, but I'll stop there and answer any questions that anybody may have.
Thanks very much, Steve. I would like to ensure that is circulated to members, and in future, picking up on Ian's point, I think the idea of pre-circulating where it's possible is important, so that we've got a proper opportunity to ask questions. I have Michelle and Gilbert raising their hands. Councillor Gregory.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Just a couple of questions. In terms of people who are currently in arrears and with the rent going up, do you have any sense or idea of how many of those people will not be able to pay off their arrears or be able to pay their rent, or what impact it will have on them being able to keep up to date with their rent? Do you have any sense of that? And the other thing I wanted to ask was that I thought 2.5 million bad debt provisions quite high. What is that? Just what's that provision for? Is it for rent arrears, or is it for repairs which cost more than budgeted? I just wondered if there was a breakdown of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose in relation to and as Ian set out, the proposed rent increase is 4.1%, which is about a £4.70 weekly increase. Obviously, we work with the residents and tenants to support them. We know approximately 60% of our tenants are in receipt of housing benefit or universal credit. So where their rent goes up, the council's rents are within the local housing allowance, so that benefit, be it housing benefit or UC, will increase in line with that. So those 60% of tenants that already receive benefit won't have to pay any extra. It will be covered by the benefit bill. Obviously, we recognise, this is a time when a lot of residents, a lot of people in the borough are suffering and struggling financially. We do have a tenancy sustainment team and a financial inclusion team that work as part of the income management team, that work alongside the income recovery staff to support residents to make sure that they are managing as effectively as possible, that they are accessing as many benefits as possible, and also support them with dealing with other debts and to help them prioritise debts as well, and sometimes arranging for other debts to be deferred or to be cleared. So we have that support, but we cannot, and I cannot sit here in front of you and guarantee that everybody will not be impacted on as a result of having a 4.1% rent increase.
Thanks for that.
With regards to the bad debt provision, that is just for where we write off a debt. So, like I said, it's not a current arrears. The current arrears, we would always keep that debt as a live debt and work with that tenant to recover that debt. If that tenant was to end their tenancy of their own accord, or if they were to be evicted, then we move on to trying to recover that debt as a former tenant's debt, former tenant's arrears. Ultimately, we may, at a point, decide that it's not economical to continue to recover that debt, and we would write it off. And that is what the bad debt provision is for.
Great. Thanks very much. Councillor Smythe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got 1,000 questions. I'm not going to ask them all, obviously, but yes, I think I heard before that you do 100,000 repairs per year. Is that right? Did I hear that figure somewhere in that region?
It's probably around 70,000.
Yeah, so 7,000 repairs still to do is not too bad in relation to the amount that we do pretty much per year. So, I mean, I'd say, during the pandemic, you've done really, really well. So congratulations for that. But you did say that you've got a repairs action plan. I'm just wondering, kind of, is there a date where you want to get those 7,000 completed? Basically, that's the first question. I welcome the fact that you've got 30 more staff coming on the books. I welcome the leaks priority thing. I think that's fantastic, because I think leaks are really problematic. Well, certainly in my experience, the sooner you can get to them, the better. And I was just wondering about the mobile repair app. When councillors kind of have a housing case, obviously, the constituents are very concerned about it usually. Is there any way that members could be kind of have access to what's going on with their specific case through that app? I'm just throwing that in there. You may not have thought about that, but it might be useful. So, excuse me, 1 second. Turn it off. Yes, sorry about that. And then on the 8,292 arrears in the £0 to £1,000 band, roughly how much is that? I don't know. You probably don't know, but it might be useful to know that figure. And then the last question, sorry, Chair, I know it's quite a lot. In terms of our housing strategy, 2017 to 22, this is a broad question. How do you think, and if you don't know the answer, it's fine. How do you think COVID has affected that strategy? Has it slowed it down? Has it changed it? Obviously we'll have learnings from COVID that we could introduce into the next strategy. So it's just a comment really about moving forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Smythe. Try and pick those up quickly. Yes, we're doing 70,000 repairs a year. 7,000 outstanding repairs. I suppose the challenge is we would normally, if we're doing about 5,500 repairs a month, we would normally expect to get through those. So that 7,000 repairs is over and above our normal work in progress, so to speak. And some of those repairs have been outstanding 3-4 months because of trying to get to them. So I think it is critical that we do try and get that down. Yes, we recognise for 15 months we were doing emergency repairs only. So there's a backlog of repairs of demand for people reporting that because we weren't taking them, and that's hit us now, and we want to be able to address that. I think with regards to the repairs app, the mobile app that we're rolling out at this point in time is just for operatives. So it's about allocating the work to them, and then being able to then, if they're not able to complete the repair at that first point in call, actually then to be able to order the follow-on repair and appoint it. What we are looking to do longer term is to have an online repairs reporting tool. So that would then allow resident tenants to order a repair and book an appointment in the same way somebody might order their Tesco shopping and order a delivery slot. Obviously at that point in time, members, if on behalf of tenants, we may be able to create an access so that members on behalf of tenants can utilise that to report a repair if a tenant comes to yourself. The 8,292 tenants that all between nothing and 1,000, that's 2.36 million.
Great, thanks very much. I've got Deirdre wanting, and then Councillor Gordon.
Sorry, Chair. The comment I was going to make as part, there's no need for, because Steve's covered it. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Sorry.
I was just, the point I was going to make was related to the provision, but Steve covered it in his response.
Great. All right. Thanks very much, Judy. Yeah, Councillor Gordon.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I mean, obviously, it's very challenging and complex situation. And thanks very much for your report. I mean, it obviously would be good to study it at sort of slightly more leisure. It's good to hear about progress being made in relation to voids and the allocation of voids. But I mean, obviously, there is still some reasonably significant delay in families being housed in these void properties, and obviously every sort of family that's being delayed in being housing is a family that's going to be under sort of additional stress, and I mean that is and also in relation to the delays in the allocation of housing benefit. So I mean, it is good to hear that the that the HRA is going to be balanced, but I mean, obviously there is still a number of different stressors and risks in relation to this service, and these are impacting on our residents. I mean, I just really wondered when you think the situation is going to be in a sort of better position. I mean, obviously the budget is being balanced this year because of additional savings. Are we going to be having to look at the same position next year? And also, are there any other resources or staffing? I mean, I appreciate you're dealing with the impact of the cyber attack as well as the pandemic and everything else. But is there anything else we can do to move these things forward? And what position do you think we're going to be in this time next year? Thank you.
I'll answer your last one first. I haven't got a crystal ball, so I'm not going to be able to say what position we'll be in this time next year, apart from better than we are now. I think voids is like you say, it's a real challenge, because every week that a property is not let, is A, we've got a loss of income, but B, and as equally, if not more important for me, is we've got a family that's not getting the opportunity to have that property, and that's potentially resulting in somebody, as you said, being at stress, families being at stress, people being in temporary accommodation, and that has a knock-on impact on other parts of the council as well. So we do need to get those properties re-let as quickly as possible. I'm confident if I was sat here this time, or when I'm sat here this time next year, that we will be well on our way to getting back to being in a position where we were pre-pandemic, if not a little bit better. With regards to the balanced budget, we are presenting savings as part of the budget report to Cabinet later this month, and that will facilitate a balanced budget for 2022-23 as well. We are going to be doing a review of the housing revenue account business plan next year as a fundamental review, because we do recognise, we will need to continue to make efficiency savings year on year, but we also recognise there's some real pressures that are coming over the hill that are hitting us. Obviously, rent arrears is one of them, and we expect that to be an improving position, but we also know that actually we're seeing increase in material costs, and significant increase in material costs and contractor costs for capital improvements. So that's a real challenge for us when we're looking to move forward. But we also have a real challenge, probably not in the next year or so, but certainly in the next 5 years, 10 years, around the council's aspirations and quite rightly everybody's aspirations to move towards carbon net zero, and the cost of that are going to be quite astronomical. So we need to factor that in so that we understand, what the potential impact on the housing revenue account will be.
Thank you. Councillor Rodds.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to have 2 points, but the first one was actually addressed by Councillor Smythe's question about the 70,000 backlog, what sort of percentage of that of a normal year. Turns out it's between 1 and 2 months repairs, which obviously is too high, but it's being addressed and we know why. But what I do want to ask about is we have to address what I would see as the elephant in the room. We're talking about a balanced HRA and potentially reducing rent arrears. But I don't want to get into a blame game and say why it's happened and what has happened. But the fact is, we found out in the last couple of days that the energy cap is going to go up by approximately 51% in April. Now, it's always referred to as people have to heat or eat when they're on that sort of budget, low budget, but also rent comes into the equation. And personally, I think there's going to be a lot of people who will be under highly increased pressure whether or not they can pay their rents. And this is obviously going to have an impact on the HRA. Have we taken this into account? And I know we can't do anything about it at this stage, but and it's hopefully only a short-term effect, because hopefully energy costs will go down once the gas taps are turned back on or whatever, for whatever reason. But have we taken this into account? And if not, what are we going to do about it?
Great, good question. I do think that emphasises the point that we are on a real tightrope around the housing revenue account. The pressures of long-term capital reductions, meaning that our repairs budget is going to go up over the long term. Point you made about pressure on people's incomes and therefore on rent repayments, and the fact the housing revenue account has to be self-funding, it's self-contained. So there is a real risk area, and I think that is only going to get a higher risk over the next period. And I do suggest we need to keep a very close eye on how this is managed. I do see this alongside the SEND funding, the adult social care support, as being the most vulnerable points in terms of our finances and service. I don't know.
We've lost you, Nick.
Deirdre, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the level of rent, you know, the sustainability of the HRA and the impact of the increasing rent arrears and the pressures on tenants to pay rents. As part of the setting of the budget for this year and last year, we have carefully considered the contribution to the provision of bad debts, and we have got a healthy provision for bad debts, and going forward we've built in £2.5 million per year in case rent arrears increase. However, you know, with the actions that Steve and his team are taking, we do expect that the level of increase in rent arrears will plateau and start to come down. So in terms of financial sustainability, we do have you know, at the present time, sufficient budget to set aside to manage that risk. It's continually being looked at. We have rent arrears levels and collection rates on a weekly basis from the rent team, and we will fully assess that bad debt provision. But we have the financial inclusion teams that support families and households getting into problem with their rents. But we have been impacted by the pandemic for the most part in paying rents. So we have got sufficient financial plans in place.
Yeah. Colleagues, I'm just very conscious, now past 8 o'clock. Gilbert, I think you've already had one crack. I think I'm going to, unless it's a point of great urgency, can't be raised elsewhere. Are there any other points? Ian, you wanted to?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's Steve. You can write to me about these. These are just various questions. First of all, I noticed mention of algorithms being used and helping officers. I have quite a lot of suspicions about algorithms, having been stitched up electorally on one occasion by an algorithm being misleading. So if you could write to me, Steve, and explain how exactly that is going to work. And then secondly, I wondered how we are helping people to cope with their arrears. That touches on Councillor Gregory's question, but I wondered what are our current setup for helping people to cope with their arrears, the kind of advice that might be given, or how else we structure repayments and so on. And thirdly, I just wondered, it probably is there somewhere, if you could just let me know at some point how much the percentage of arrears is to the actual whole account, how much it takes up in terms of the whole budget. And actually, fourthly, I've just, from the question to Councillor Odds, I would rather like to hear more about more details about how exactly it is going to be tackled in terms of the energy hike, because it is going to be quite significant, as I think Councillor Odds has mentioned, and I don't think that question was fully answered. I think there needs to be, I need to hear something a bit more solid, that we are going to actually, we have, as it were, in place something to assess exactly how that might work out, even if it's only a theoretical model. Thank you.
Great, excellent points. Can we take up Ian's suggestion then of getting a response? I don't think it's just from Steve, because those points go more widely. So Ashman, I mean, if you can pick that up with Steve, I'd be grateful. And I think not just send the responses to Ian, I'd like them to go to all of the committee, actually. Okay, apologies for rushing people, but I did promise a break, and I suggest that we have a sort of 5-minute just a kind of stretch the legs break, and then come back and hear on the neighbourhoods and housing and neighbourhoods directorate, the risks on that. Thanks very much. we're down to three members here, but that's quorum, so we can carry on. Right, Ashman, do you want to take us through the paper?
Yeah, sure.
Which identifies the key risks, which are, all of which I think map onto the key issues that you've identified, the red items on the risk register. So if you could take us through those, please, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, and hello everyone again. So this is our annual update on terms of the Directorate, Neighbourhood and Housing Directorate Risk Register. Just worth pointing out that we do have departmental level risk registers as well. So some of the stuff that's in here will emanate from those departmental ones. There's 13 risks in the appendix, one extra one compared to the same time last year, and that extra one is the one that Steve picked up on regarding the repairs backlog. So I'm not going to dwell on that other than to say that is a additional risk that we put on the register because we wanted to make sure that we gave it the due attention that it needed from a senior level and make sure that action is in place to address that. Not only just because it's important to deal with, but reputation is not good for the council to have backlogs, and more importantly, it's inappropriate to have residents living in properties where repairs aren't being carried out in a timely manner. That's really important. So my expectation is that this time next year, that risk won't be on the register, and we will have dealt with it satisfactorily over the next few months. The other risks that are sort of touch on the red zone, if you like, it's really four others. Ones we've talked about is really the pandemic and the impact that has on neighbourhoods and housing, both in terms of service delivery, but also in terms of the impact that it has on our income, but equally the impact that it has on the cost as well. So over the last 18 months, not only have we had reduced income, we've also had to spend more money on dealing with the pandemic. So the budget pressure is an important risk for us that we need to deal with, and we've dealt with that through finding savings and being more efficient. It's also worth pointing out that unlike in the general fund, the housing revenue account hasn't had any government support to be able to deal with some of those budget pressures. So we've had to find savings and efficiencies to deal with that. So what impact does that have on customers? Well, I think it affects customer satisfaction. So again, that's another risk area that touches on the red zone. If we don't provide the services that people expect in the way that they expect it, and performance is impacted, then that clearly has an impact on customer satisfaction. I think one of the big things for me, as far as the risk register is concerned this year, is that not only the pandemic, but the ICT and the cyber has had a really big impact, I think, on neighbourhoods and housing services, particularly three service areas in my directorate. Planning has been one of those, business and regulatory services, but more significantly, it's been the housing services, which is very IT reliant, and everything that is done in the housing service relies on IT. And you probably won't believe me if I said that staff had actually gone to pen and paper, and when I've been down in the council, down at the depot, there's been piles and piles of A4 paper on staff desks, actually putting out job tickets and waiting to input them onto the computer system. So that really, I think, has drawn staff's attention to not only deal with the pandemic, but also trying to find workarounds to deal with the cyber. And we've been working really hard collectively, both with ICT colleagues, to try and develop new systems, or some of them almost from scratch. And that is still not complete, and more work needs to be done. So that, I think, for me, has been a really, really impactful for the service. And the other thing that's affected us is the Deliver the Capital programme, which Jackie has mentioned, so I'll not dwell on that. Again, we've not been able to deliver all our capital programmes finances in the way that we'd want to, for two reasons. First of all, that we'd reached the limit of our overall spend for the contracts that we had in place. And secondly, there was delays in re-procuring some of that work. And as a consequence of that, that's also had an impact. And of course, the pandemic with contractors not being able to carry out the works. So in a nutshell, they're the main risks, 13 of those, 1 new one, 5 in the red zone. There's lots of mitigations in place in the Appendix 1, as you'll see, and there's also what Steve has highlighted to in the previous agenda item. So I'll take any questions, Councillor Sharman.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, I have a question from Councillor Rodds.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to come back to the same point again, but the likelihood of an increase in rent arrears is not specifically mentioned in this risk register. It's mentioned in passing on a couple of points, and it obviously underlies a lot of things. But I think in the current situation, we really do need a separate item that addresses the likelihood, not the possibility, but I would say the great likelihood of there being an increase in rent arrears.
Thank you. Asma? I mean, the other issue, I guess, is the Director of Finance ought to come in on this as well, because it's a long-term problem, not just for housing, but for the council as a whole. But Asman, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think obviously we have made some provisions, as has been highlighted already, councillors, in terms of what the impact will be if of bad debt coming from rent arrears. I mean, my expectation is that if we cast our mind back, pre-pandemic, a lot of these areas of performance, and I know Councillor Sharman, I've been to these committees where you've sort of challenges on the performance, and I would say that whether it's been rent, or whether it's been voids, or whether it's been repairs, they've all been going in the right direction pre-pandemic. So I'm confident that once we've got the IT systems in place, that we will be able to reverse that trajectory and go in that right direction. So that is one of the, the fact that staff haven't had the tools to be able to carry out their work effectively has been a major impact in some of the performances. So I'm really confident once we've got that sorted out, things will go in the right direction.
You want to come back on that?
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry to seem to contradict you with respect. I know you're the expert, but from what we've heard in the last few days, particularly about energy costs, I don't think there's any doubt. And it's not going to affect housing. It's going to affect, as Chair alluded to, it's going to affect council tax collection. It's going to affect a lot of areas of council income. The increase in energy costs is going to be so huge for the especially for a low-income family, because they are affected more by energy costs. Especially, we have a borough with a considerable number of large young children families, and we have a considerable number of elderly people in the borough, both of whom need extra energy in terms of heating. And I cannot see that this will not affect people's ability to pay their debts, such as rent and council tax and various other things. And I really do think that we need to look at worst case scenarios, as well as what's happening at the moment and what happened before COVID, because I think we're in a totally different situation from there was before COVID.
Thanks, sir.
So I think,
Ian, do you want to come back?
So if that's okay, Councillor Sharman. So very quickly, I would completely agree with you, Councillor Odds. It is a different scenario we're facing, isn't it? And it's a scenario on the back of not just energy price increases, but other inflationary pressures as well, affecting everything from food people buy to whole range of factors. So it's something which myself and the finance teams, when setting the estimates and making our assumptions around, obviously the one most immediately on our minds at the moment is going to be the council tax assumptions, and probably the most challenging year to actually do that forecast, because of the challenges we've got with pandemic, with cyber, and with other shocks in the economy, and as you allude to, the ongoing issues with fuel costs as well. So there is, in the work we're doing, recognition of some of that. Obviously it's very difficult, isn't it, to model precisely what that could be, but we're certainly mindful of the need for additional prudence to be sensible about that. I also think it's something that when we look at those other hardship type schemes, again, looking at the criteria for some of those, we might need to give thought to how they can be dispensed in terms of that as well. So we are very live to it, but I think we've also got to recognise the relative limits to what we as a council can actually do in these situations as well. So again, it will be something that I'm sure members across the chamber will want to consider opportunities to further lobby for additional supports or transition arrangements or other mechanisms that might exist, because as we all know, there are limits to what we as a council can physically do.
Great. Well, the debate will no doubt or has to continue. From the point of this committee, I think it's important we do two things. One is to keep a very close eye on that and to reassure ourselves that there are financial strategies by which we can go as far as possible to mitigate the risks in this area. But I think Councillor Hodds makes a very important point that this is a key risk that we as a council will need to keep a close eye on over the next year plus, I'd adjust.
If I can come back, Councillor Sharman, I think, Steve in his presentation did make comments about the financial support and inclusion and tenancy support that we have in place for residents that are in difficulty. It's really important that, residents, if they are in difficulty, get in touch with us so that, the sooner we know their problems, the better we can actually help and support them. But it's also worth perhaps noting that, during the pandemic and the cyber, some of those arrears have arisen because some people just haven't paid. Even, some of those people have had the resource to be able to pay, they just haven't paid. And we've not been able to take any action against them simply because of the fact that we didn't have a proper IT system and weren't able to look at all the balances, etc. So we will provide support where needed, but we also need to make sure that where people don't engage with us, then we have to, robustly try and get those arrears back. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Okay, Councillor Smythe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I do agree. The cost of living crisis is really bad at the moment, and it's getting worse. But I just wanted to refer, because I think it's relevant to risk title NH002 on the climate change emergency, and just ask a couple of questions about that. I mean, obviously, in regards to retrofitting and insulating our properties, that's key for energy costs, as would be community energy, solar panels, for example, on some of our housing stock on estates, like Bannister House, for example. But I just wanted to look at the language in there, because it's saying that, in regards to climate change, on the page, I don't know if you're looking at it, it's page 114, could be a result of a lack of overall awareness or buy-in to the concept, or a lack of resources to proactively bring about change. As far as I'm aware, we've voted on a climate emergency motion recently, so I think that we've kind of bought into the concept. I'm not sure. I'd like to, whoever's written that, to kind of explain that point really about buying in, because I thought we bought into it already. And then just on the latest note in regards to that particular risk, it mentions that the government is finalising the environmental bill of 21, which was last year. I'm just wondering if we've managed to have a look at that and draft something around that, in essence. And then just further down, finally, Chair, just bear with me, it talks about flooding and it talks about the Lee Valley area. But as you know, we had kind of flooding recently in Homerton just through rainfall. And I'm just wondering, kind of, have we been thinking about that kind of thing as well? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Ashman, any comments on those 2 points?
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that although this risk appears on our Directorate risk register, it's a council-wide risk as well, and it's not just our neighbourhoods and housing services that will be delivering against the climate agenda. It's a completely corporate action that's required, an endeavour that's required to be able to address that. So that's the first point to make, I think. I take your point about the language. We'll correct that if that's and make sure that's reflected in the revised version, Councillor Smythe, in relation to the buy-in. I think in terms of the retrofit point, that's a good point that you make in solar panels. That is going to be significantly expensive to deal with, to completely deal with retrofitting all our stock, and certainly Hackney Council isn't alone in this. This is something that's industry sector wide, and I haven't come across any colleagues or professionals who've got the answer in terms of how they're going to be able to retrofit all of their stock. But we have got a London-wide action plan, which deals with retrofitting, and we're working collectively at a pan-London level to look at how we can do this. So there's a bit of a learning exercise taking place in terms of how we implement that. But one of the things that we can do is to look at our existing capital investment and making sure that we deal with a fabric-first approach, making sure that the investment that we make, we've done everything that we can possibly do to improve the insulation of properties in the first place, and where the gap will be is looking at the heating technology really. And there's a risk, isn't there, in terms of whether you, and people have been talking about, well, do we go for hydrogen and so on, and there's a risk in terms of, well, what's the most appropriate technology to do right now, and do you wait and see until the industry catches up, etc., etc. So there's a lot of research going on collectively to be able to find, what would be the most appropriate way to deal with that. And a rough estimate, just to give you an indication, is that we've had figures of around £500 million to be able to retrofit all of our existing stock, and that can range on average between at the low end around £20,000 per property to the upper end around £50,000 property. So what that does do is if you do a complete retrofit where you've dealt with the fabric and you've got an energy efficient system in, whether it's air source heat pump or ground source, etc., then that can do two things. A, it reduces the CO2 emissions, and B, also addresses the energy charges, which Councillor Odders are remarking on. So in terms of fuel poverty, that's money in residents' pockets. But all of these things will take time to implement. And one of the things that we are doing is we're looking to identify some pilots in the borough over the next year to see what would be the best approach to be able to address that particular challenge. And in terms of the flooding point that you mentioned, we are doing a piece of work around how we can better manage flooding, whether it's rainfall as well. So there's a piece of work I've asked my team to look at producing in terms of how we can better mitigate against that. And that's not dealing with floods from things like Thames water burst and so on. It's more about the rainfall, etc., surface water, and where certain properties might be at higher risk and what we need to do to address that. So there's a piece of work that I've commissioned in relation to that. And I think you mentioned about the environment bill. I wasn't quite sure what you wanted me to say on that.
Well, the fact that it's been published, we need to obviously have a look at that and factor that into our kind of projections going forward. Really, that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I don't see any other members indicating. So can we thank you, Ashman, for your report. But clearly a lot to keep an eye on, and we may well be coming back to you, I think, to particularly follow this issue about housing debt and repairs. Okay, let's move on then. The next item is the corporate risk register. First of all, I do think the improved format for this is welcome, both in terms of having it as a separate report and of it having a more regular framework for it. And I think that appears also in the Directorate, the Neighbourhoods and Housing Directorate risk register. There seems to be a common framework emerging, and I would ask that framework is followed for all the reports. In other words, we have a common way in which risk is assessed and set out for us. Right, with that, are you going to introduce this, Matthew?
Yep, happy to. So the corporate register that you have in front of you was actually completed in late November and signed off by Hackney's management team in mid-December. So although it does refer to the early stages of Omicron, it doesn't quite capture the very latest picture, especially as things are continuing to change on a daily basis. So the dominant themes of the corporate register remain broadly the same as they were when it was last reviewed in October. The ongoing impacts of the pandemic continue to cast a shadow along with the aftermath of the cyber attack. Both of these risks are compounding the effects of other risks, with the cyber attack affecting overall service delivery across the directorates and the pandemic having numerous consequences, particularly evidenced by financial risks within this register. There are no dramatic changes in the scores since October, but one good bit of news is a reduction in the score of the pensions risk relating to poor membership data, which has moved from being a red to an amber risk. This is due to positive progress made in the automation of data. As we've just been hearing about from Ajman, the housing repair risk is clearly very important, and that's likely to be escalated to this register at the next iteration, which will be due to you in April. But otherwise, that's a brief summary, and obviously happy to take any questions.
Any points colleagues want to raise on this? My one observation is that on the workforce, the likelihood of real pressures on the workforce seems underplayed in light of the Omicron outbreak. So that may pick up your point, Matthew, that this being a bit of a reverse look rather than a forward look at risk.
I would expect at the next iteration that to be higher.
Just for members' benefit, obviously you'll have seen the email that I sent out to you just before the Christmas break in terms of the arrangements the council stood up for the festive period. And we continue to make sure that we monitor the situation, particularly for those services that we continue to operate almost as business as usual. Whilst we have seen an increase in members of staff affected by Omicron at this stage, and we updated our sit reps, which is the mechanism by which we identify any issues and then cascade that through to sort of London regional groups. At this stage, Hackney isn't reporting some of the issues we're seeing in some of those councils outside of London. I think most notably in the press, there were pictures, weren't there, in Glasgow, in Birmingham around waste not being collected. That is not the situation in Hackney, and obviously we see that with our own eyes, don't we? The teams are continuing to do fantastic work, albeit in pressured circumstances, but it is a situation we continue to update. But I just wanted to provide that assurance that we're not experiencing some of the challenges that we are seeing councils in other parts of the country experiencing at this stage.
Good. I mean, I'm reassured that we have reopened the gold oversight mechanism, which to me is one of the learning points from the first wave, that we keep that very much as our first line of strategic oversight. I have Councillor Lynch.
Our group director's already answered my question. It was just if we could have a mini update on where we were, obviously because of the fact of things have escalated, but it sounds like everyone's got a grip on it. And I think, like you say, I see the lads and lasses out on the bins and they're still collecting stuff on bank holidays as well, which is commendable. So I think that's great to see. But yeah, there was definitely a risk. I think as soon as I realised that there was a risk in the NHS, I think in my mind I was thinking this is going to affect bins, it's going to affect our teachers, this is going to affect other sort of key workforce areas. But yeah, so it's been answered. But thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Right, well, let's move on with that to the next item, which is Michael Sheffield for the Audit and Anti-Fraud Quarterly Progress Report.
Thank you, Chair. The report that you have for both the audit and the investigations covers the 2 months period since we last updated committee. In that time, trends have continued in the same direction and there's not been any significant divergence in terms of performance in the interim. So what I'm going to do is just concentrate on one issue from audit and one from investigations and then take any questions after, if that's okay. So on the audit side, and I did allude to this at the last meeting, the most pressing issue that we have is the impact of the cyber attack in terms of how that is enabling audit work to proceed. It is genuinely the case that some audits cannot progress because systems that need to be tested and reviewed are not available, and interim measures are not long-term features, and it undervalues the audit work that would take place on that basis. You will see at paragraph 4.1 of Appendix 1 to the report a list of audits that have been postponed because of the cyber attack. It's also worth noting that this is the second year of reduced audit coverage due to both the pandemic impacts and cyber. Pandemic, in terms of audit, those effects they've receded. All staff are available for audit work at present. But I am acutely aware of the importance of getting the 22-23 audit plan right, making sure that the work that we want to do is achievable, and getting full cooperation from all auditees to ensure that that's delivered, and also identifying the key audits from within that, so that at year end we're in a position to give the assurance to yourselves and others that we need to be able to do. So that's the key theme on the audit side. On the investigation side, as I say, it is largely business as usual. Outcomes from investigations are continuing in a positive direction since what we've all been through in the last 2 years. The report does draw out that we have updated some of the metrics that we base the outcomes from the tenancy fraud work on. That is because a piece of benchmarking activity took place, not just for Hackney, but more widely than that across London and the rest of the country. And it looked at how long subletting offences typically last for, what the impact of that is on the waiting list and the costs that arise to local authorities, and also the investigation and the legal costs to take these matters to court and get a resolution. And that has resulted in a significant upshift in the financial value that's attributed to tenancy fraud. In all the time that I've reported to committee, we've used a figure of 18,000 per sublet, and the benchmarking activity revises that upwards to 42,000. So that is a sizable change. I'm satisfied that it's not over-egging the pudding, and I'm also conscious that it doesn't really take away from the key measure, which is the delivery of additional units to house people in priority need from the waiting list. And that would continue to be my key way of assessing that work, but I think it is useful to have an updated financial figure just to focus minds in addition to the key metric there. And at that point, I'll pause and take any questions.
Great, thanks very much. Yes, Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry to bang on about the point that's been made previously in relation to other reports. This report at the end refers to appendices 1 through 4, which are not in the printed agenda. I know it's a weighty document already, but if we don't have them in front of us, I think it's rather difficult to assess our reaction.
I'm sorry, Councillor Odds, which part of the report was that?
Sorry, I'm looking at page 188 of the Audit and Anti-Fraud Progress Report.
The appendices aren't included in the printed documents. They were circulated as the electronic versions.
Yeah, I can only apologise. I don't know why that is. We'll follow up after the meeting and see if we can get to the bottom of that.
Can we make sure Councillor Odds receives a printed copy of those appendices? there were a number of things that didn't appear in the printed document, and I understand all the pressures over Christmas and so on, but it's there's some quite serious gaps in the printed material. Thanks for raising that. I mean, the conclusions I draw from this are, first of all, that we have basically kept an internal audit service going during a lot of staff pressures and moving people out. And I think that says a lot about management of the internal audit and of the compliance generally of the culture in Hackney. So I think we can take some reassurance from that. However, I am concerned that we do get back to a proper internal, fully staffed audit function, because if we don't, and already we can see it. For example, although the value of recovered tenancies goes up because the price that's attached to them has gone up, the actual number is not what I would expect. Now, unless people have suddenly stopped trying to play games with tenants, with their tenancies, which I don't believe, it means that we are paying some cost for moving internal audit resource into other areas to cope with the pandemic. So I do think there's just a sort of point to note that you always pay a price somewhere if you take your foot off the accelerator. But as I say, I do come back to commending internal audit for keeping the process going through difficult times. But we need to get back to a full service. I think that's the point I'd like to make.
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify, we do have a full service. We do have everyone back on the team that should be back on the team, and I'm expecting that to continue.
Yeah, no, I'm looking backwards. No, but I'm just, in a sense, saying if we have a further waves of this, then people need to be aware that we do pay a price if we move people out of internal audit. But thanks for that. Okay, we now move on to a paper on the external audit appointment. Jackie, are you?
Yes, I'll pick up that one. So this paper is in connection with the external audit appointment for the period 23-24 to 27-28. Effectively, there's a decision to be taken by full council around whether the council opts into the national collective scheme administered by the public sector audit appointments or makes other arrangements. So what the report does, it sets out what the other options might be, which includes joining with other authorities or going it alone in terms of those appointments, or going ahead with the PSA arrangements. It comes to the conclusion that, on balance, that the most effective way forward, and I think there are limits in terms of what the benefits would be for going with a joint approach or on our own. Or, on balance, we would recommend that we go forward with the PSA arrangements. And what the report does, it recommends that the Audit Committee recommend this option to full council, basically, because it's a decision which is reserved for full council. And note that recommendation will be included in the budget report. In the report, it says the budget report was going to be heard in February. That date's now moved to the 2nd of March, as we heard earlier today. But this recommendation will be included in that report, as will be the delegation to Ian in relation to informing the PSXA of our decision and also making arrangements for that external audit appointment.
Great, thanks very much. Any questions on that? I think the arguments are pretty compelling, frankly, on this. It's not ideal, particularly given the crisis that there's been generally in the industry and under PSAA oversight, and the fact that we have also been a victim of that. So this is not a happy picture, but frankly, I think this is making the best course in an unhappy state. So unless members have got any objections, I propose we approve that. Well, in fact, the only people who can vote are the people in the room. So are you happy to go along and support that? I'm getting assent. So
yeah, agreed.
Great. You can't. It's only us in the room who can approve. But it's good to know, Gilbert, that you also support it. Good. Let's move on then to the external audit plan. And I have to say, here we having an audit plan for a year that finished 9 months ago, or nearly 8 months ago, rather. This is not a happy position, but it's something I think that, as I say, is a more general part, a more general problem. But I don't know. Are you going to introduce this, Ian, and then Mazars come in, or how you want to play this?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, this report sets out the audit plan for, as you say, for 2021 in relation to the audit of the accounts and of the pension fund accounts. It is much later than you would normally expect. It's not entirely due to the audit situation. It's partly due to the cyber attack as well, we should say, because our accounts were published later than the deadline because of the additional work that we needed to do to get those accounts together this year. But I suggest we might want to hand over to our colleagues who are on the call from Mazars to talk to the report, or to the appendix, I might add.
Yep. So, do you want to introduce yourself? Is Suresh on the line? Oh, am I hearing?
Suresh is on mute. You're on mute, Suresh.
Oh, still not hearing him. I don't see him up there. Is he on?
I can see him, but I can't hear him. I can
Yeah.
hear him. Sorry, Mr. Patel.
we can't even see him, Michelle. Oh, is he there? Yeah. Suresh, have a crack at. Your mic seems to be open but not working. Oh, he's got IT problems. I don't know. Stuart, are you able to help on this?
Let's see if mine works. Mine works.
Yep, we can hear you. Do you want to try and say what Suresh would have said?
I think Suresh would probably have talked us through the two memorandums, starting with the council one. As you said, this is a bit later than we'd normally present, both in part a reaction to the prior year audit finishing late and also to the issues arising from the cyber attack, which has put us quite a considerable period down the line in terms of being able to plan for the audit. I draw, starting with the councillor, and apologies if I get the page references wrong, I'm looking at an online version rather than the version that is in a pack. I would draw particular attention to the significant risks we've identified in section 4. You'll see unusually there's quite a list in there compared to previous years. This is in part recognition of prior issues, particularly around valuation of property and equipment, including investment properties, as well as the pension scheme. We also recognise there are some particular issues associated arising from the cyber attack and the level of estimates and judgment that management have had to apply in preparing their statement of accounts, particularly as a result of the impact on the council tax, NNDR and housing benefit system, the academy account system, which has caused a lot of estimates or judgments to be reached in respect of the collection fund entries, so council tax and business rates, as well as the housing benefit expenditure in terms of your payment of benefits, which obviously you may be aware were at a set level for a period of time until the system was back up and running in full. There was also issues associated with estimates around the housing revenue account, again, as a result of the cyber attack and the impact on the, I have to be thinking of the universal housing system, and the collection and recording of rents within the system and hence your accounts. These are very specific issues for the current year. We may come back to them in future years, depending on where we get to with the current year and the assessment. I'm looking at Suresh. I'd also draw attention to section 5, value for money. That sets out the updated value for money requirements for the 2020-21 audit. These are in line with PSAA issued and NAO issued guidance on the value for money approach this year. It's It's an increased level of work covering 3 specific areas around financial sustainability, which is interesting to hear the talk at the start with Ian on your position, etc., and all of that will feed into our consideration on this front. Your overall governance, again, a lot of conversation, the sort of issues that are coming up to Audit Committee, and your overall improvement of economy, efficiency and effectiveness, the old value for money, if you like.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Ah, okay, I've resolved it. Well, actually, Stuart, you probably said everything I was going to say, but just one more thing was just on audit fees. You'll see in both plans, we've been probably more transparent than we have been in prior years about additional audit fees in the specific areas that we've then focused on, particularly 1920, which we are currently seeking to agree that with the Group Director. But for 2021, we've also included some ranges for additional fees for additional areas of work. But we've also referenced where PSAA themselves have published some suggested additional fee ranges for the changes to the VFM code responsibilities that Stuart just referenced, but also a change in the auditing standard for auditing estimates, which, as Stuart has already highlighted, your accounts this year will clearly, for 2021, will clearly contain a significant level of accounting estimates. Other than that, and just conscious of time, I think we'll be happy to move to questions, Chair.
Thanks, Suresh. No doubt you would have introduced you and Stuart if you'd been able to talk. But just for the record, you would just want to introduce the new Mazars team to the committee.
Yeah, so I'm Suresh Patel, so I've taken over from Lucy as the key audit partner. I'm a partner with the firm, and I've got 28 years of experience of auditing local councils, including a number of London boroughs. And I think you know Stuart, because Stuart was involved in the audit in the prior year.
Great, thank you. I mean, I must say that just a couple of points. First of all, I think the VFM, the fuller VFM value for money assessment is very welcome, and I look forward to seeing that explored. The other point, I suppose, is that I am concerned that we do the new team does conduct this external audit in a brisker pace than we managed to get through the last one. So I'd appreciate full support from the company to make sure that we can try and pull back the timetable, which again could go as much as a year over. And that's just not acceptable. And I realise that's not about Mazars, it's about a wider issue in the industry, but it's, I think, important to put on record how disturbed we are that the basic accountability based on the accounts and reporting the state of the council is so way behind the reality. So with that, shall we move on to the next item, which is the external audit plan. Sorry, the external auditor's annual letter.
Yes, so this again is a report which comes slightly out of time because of the delays to the 1920 audit, but this does sort of draw a line under the 1920 audit, reflecting that the opinion was given on the 21st of October, and that following the additional work that was required to be undertaken by Mazars as a result of the cyber attack to reach a conclusion on our VFM arrangement, that work is now complete, and there's no adverse impact on that opinion. So that is certainly good news for the committee. And also, it's worth noting that the auditors haven't been required to exercise any of their formal powers this year. I don't know if our auditors want to add anything to that, or if that covers.
No, as you say, Jackie, it's a summary of conclusion of the 1920 audit.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Unless there are any other comments on that, let's move on to item 15, and that's the final report on our deep dive. Jackie, do you want to just introduce the report briefly? I think everyone will have read it, but we ought to record it, and then I'd like just to say something about the chair's summary.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through the report in detail. Really, it's just a record of the audit deep dive that was undertaken, and it's the second report. We received the first report of the last committee, which focused very much on the first workshop. This one focuses more into an in-depth look at some of the responses to the COVID crisis, and also what we are doing going forward in relation to that. And I think that's probably where you might want to pick up, Chair, in relation to your conclusions.
Yeah, I think this report is an excellent summary that's been prepared of the three sessions we had. And I think the broad conclusion, and I hope the committee will agree, was that we felt the council had reacted well to the first lockdown, and the response had been very encouraging, both from staff's commitment, their willingness to be flexible in the way they worked, both from home and between different, and many of them doing new and different things. And we felt that had been, given where we started from, a very positive response. Clearly, we were concerned that we had learnt from that, because we had basically to get a machine going from scratch, and we wanted to make sure that that the business planning was now in place that would ensure that we did react to future similar future threats in a really well planned way. And we've been reassured that both that the business planning for the different services and the overall strategic planning has been sharpened up and shaped up to reflect that. And I think, secondly, the fact that it has been tested over the recent weeks is encouraging, that we are able to react in similar circumstances. The bigger challenge, I think, is the long term. And I thought we had a very good discussion in our second on the workshop in November, where we looked at the long term threats and opportunities. And I think particularly the way the council is planning to work with communities and other organisations in the community and parallel services like the health services was very encouraging, that we were taking the right perspective, and the recognition that we needed to ensure that our staff were equipped with appropriate skills for that new form of work. And I think building on that, the challenge I think we're left with is that we need to ensure those plans, those support for the workforce, for new skills workforce, and the investment that we need to put into new forms of working will be sustained and are part of the council's corporate planning, because change of that magnitude requires very strong coordinated leadership from my long experience of these change programs, and it needs investment, and it's important that that's recognized in the corporate planning, and I'm suggesting that we do bring that to the attention of the executive, that challenge. So those were the couple of points I wanted to raise as conclusions for that. Any members got any dissension or additional points they'd like to make about this deep dive exercise? I'm taking silence means assent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, nothing except I think it was a really useful and valuable exercise, and and I think the report's an extremely valuable document. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to record my thanks to officers who played very helpful feedback to us during the course of that exercise. I think it cheered me up that we were looking positively at this pandemic and how we might build the best that came out of that. But I think sustaining that commitment with all the other pressures is going to be hard, and we need to keep an eye on that. Michelle, you want to raise a point?
Yeah, I just wondered if we could agree an end of meeting time, because we're now over 9 o'clock, and I just think it would be good for people to know what time we're going to finish. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I agree with that. Okay, I did say also in a note that I would raise the issue that we've got another 5 months before the new council, and I wanted to ensure that we did had some inquiry mechanism over the next few months, and I raised a couple of possibilities. One is keeping an eye on the housing issue, and the second was addressing some of the risks around climate change. And I got a very a mixed response, in other words, enthusiasts for both of them. What I was going to try and suggest is that, particularly in light of the discussion we've had this evening, it's going to be very important to ensure that we do keep an eye on the housing, particularly the progress on our repairs, and particularly the point Harvey's been emphasising, which is the debt, the impact of debt and the risks around that. I think it's very important that we do keep a close eye on that. However, I do think we might try and find a way not only to have a feedback report, perhaps a continuation of Ashman and Steve Waddington's report back to us, but also to include a review of the climate emergency, the risks that are attached to that, and the resources that we will need to put in place. So I'm going to try and work with Ian to try and find a way to do both, because I think they are both issues. It won't be a full deep dive on those. Those will be perhaps an opportunity to have a presentation to us and be able to raise issues. So if members are happy with that, I will try and arrange with Ian a way that we might achieve that. Yeah.
Chair, in terms of the deep dive into the housing, especially as you said, the points I raised about rents and affordability and etc., I think we really need to carry that on into next year, since the huge increase in energy costs is going to come in April. And, although we can consider what steps have been taken so far, I think those members of the committee that are still here next year, I won't be here, so I obviously won't be taking part, but those members that are need to carry on considering it next year once we know what the initial effects are.
I totally agree. I mean, obviously we can't fetter the hands of the future council, but I think we can make a very strong recommendation that that work is built on and carried forward. Thanks very much. With that, we then move to the final items, which are the work programme, and I propose to accept that unless anyone's got any. We do, yeah.
Sorry, can I just suggest, as I have in the past, that with the work programme, where we've got the dates of the meetings, we actually put the actual dates rather than just the month. It would be helpful to remind people.
Yep, I've noted. Thanks for that. And any other non-confidential business that members want to raise? I'm not seeing any.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to note that I had also raised concerns about rents affordability as well. Thank you. Previously.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies from Councillor Conway. I'm afraid she's texted me and I've only just seen it, so if that could be noted, yeah.
We'll record that. Peter, did you get that? Yeah. Very good. Okay. At this point, there's a proposed resolution under item 18 that the press and public be excluded from the proceedings of the Audit Committee during exempt item 20 on the grounds it's likely, in view of the nature of the business, that members of the public, this will be a disclosure of exempt business as defined by paragraph 7. I understand there is some questions raised about that.
Sorry, Chair. First of all, the actual wording of the of the resolution or motion should actually be exempt items 19 and 20, because the report that we're concerned about is really item 19, whereas 20 is any other item.
No, very, very good point. Always rely on Harvey to pick up the detail. Very helpful. Let me amend that. So this is items 19 and 20 should be exempt. There has been a point raised, and I've been taking advice from the monitoring officer that the grounds on which this is being considered are that there are possible implications of criminality, not, I hasten to add, on the part of the council, but on external ones. I don't know, perhaps you might just outline, Dawn, the issue that's raised.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Sharman. So yes, having considered the report in detail myself and having discussed with colleagues, it is my view that the report can be discussed within the exempt provisions that the authority has available to itself for the purposes as you have set out so clearly.
Great. So I am sensitive to the points raised by the objections that I've heard on this, and I'm certainly happy to have a look after this report to see if there are ways that we can make aspects of it that don't relate to this public. So we'll because I do think the issues raised are of a really broad nature. This is one of the most devastating attacks that we've received. It's had a harmful effect both on the council's operations and on residents, and we certainly want to share as much information as is possible within the constraints that Dawn has just set out for us. So a commitment, we will look at this after the report and think what we can make public.
Yeah, can I suggest that anything that we do make public be not until after the relevant authorities have finished their investigations, so that we in no way impact upon those investigations and any possibly sub judice part afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think there's absolutely no doubt we will take advice that if what we release must have no impact on possible proceedings, I'm absolutely clear about that. Yeah.
Can we just check that everyone who's in the meeting now is allowed to be in the private meeting? I don't recognise everyone. Will someone check